The United States has spent decades requiring visas from Mexicans, humiliating them at consulates, denying applications arbitrarily, and separating families over a stamp in a passport. But what happened this week in January 2026 changed the rules of the game forever. Mexico struck back, and the reaction in Washington reveals something Wall Street doesn't want you to know. The United States needs Mexico far more than it has ever admitted. Today, I will explain why this visa decision could trigger the worst economic crisis between the two countries in 170 years. Welcome. I am Richard Wolff, an economist and professor emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and for over 40 years, I have studied international economic relations. What is happening right now between Mexico and the United States is, without exaggeration, the most important moment in their bilateral relationship since the U.S. took 2.44 million square kilometers of Mexican territory in 1848. California, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, most of Colorado, and parts of Wyoming, Kansas, and Oklahoma. More than half of what was once Mexico went to the United States. And now, 178 years later, Mexico has found a way to respond without firing a single shot. Let me explain exactly what happened this week. The government of President Claudia Sheinbaum announced that starting February 1st, 2026, all U.S. citizens who want to enter Mexico for more than 7 days will need a visa. Not a simple electronic visa, but one that requires a consular appointment, financial documents, a letter explaining travel reasons, and a waiting period of up to 6 weeks. Exactly the same humiliating process Mexico has endured for decades to visit the United States. The reaction in Washington was immediate. President Trump called an emergency meeting at the White House. The State Department issued a statement calling the measure hostile and unjustified. But what no one expected was the market reaction. In the first 4 hours after the announcement, U.S. airline stocks with routes to Mexico dropped between 8 and 12%. Hotel chains with properties in Mexican tourist destinations lost billions in market value. And this is just the beginning. I want you to understand something essential. This is not a sudden decision. This is not a diplomatic tantrum. What Mexico has done is the result of months of strategic planning, and I will explain why it works as a devastating economic weapon against the United States. First, let's talk numbers. Every year, roughly 40 million Americans visit Mexico. 40 million makes Mexico the most visited international destination for U.S. citizens. They spend approximately $35 billion annually on Mexican soil. Hotels, restaurants, tours, medical services, real estate. But here's the detail Washington doesn't want you to know. That flow of tourists doesn't just benefit Mexico, it greatly benefits U.S. companies. Major U.S. airlines, American Airlines, United, Delta, Southwest, make billions every year on routes to Mexico. It's their most profitable international market. U.S. hotel chains, Marriott, Hilton, Hyatt, own hundreds of properties in Mexico that rely on this tourist flow. U.S. banks process billions in credit card transactions from tourists in Mexico. When Mexico makes it harder for Americans to enter, it doesn't just affect Mexico, it hits U.S. corporations directly. But let me share something I discovered in my research over the past few weeks. The visa requirement is not the only measure Mexico prepared. It is part of a coordinated package of economic responses that Sheinbaum's government has secretly developed since October 2025, when Trump began threatening 25% tariffs and mass deportations. In files shared with me by a contact at the Bank of Mexico, I found references to what they internally call the mirror protocol. The logic is simple, but devastating. For every restrictive measure the United States imposes on Mexico, Mexico will respond with an equivalent action that affects U.S. economic interests. The visa is just the first move. Now I want to explain why the timing is strategically brilliant. January 2026. Think about it. Trump has just started his second term. He promised his voters a hard line against Mexico, tariffs, deportations, the completed wall, but he also promised economic prosperity. And here is the dilemma he faces. Every aggressive measure against Mexico triggers a response that damages the U.S. economy. Trump's economic advisors are in panic. I will tell you what a Treasury Department official told me in a private conversation 2 weeks ago. He said, word for word, that they did not anticipate Mexico would respond this way. They thought Sheinbaum would follow the pattern of previous governments, protest diplomatically, but take no concrete action. They were completely wrong. What Washington did not understand is that Mexico has changed. The Mexico of 2026 is not the Mexico of 2018 or 2000. Its economy has diversified, international alliances have multiplied, and most importantly, the political will to confront the United States exists like it has not in generations. Let me give you historical context to understand the magnitude of this moment. For over a century, the Mexico-U.S. relationship was based on an unspoken assumption. Mexico needs the United States more than the United States needs Mexico. This assumption justified decades of asymmetry. It justified Mexico accepting unfavorable conditions in trade deals. It justified tolerating visa system humiliations. It justified looking the other way when U.S. companies extracted resources without fair compensation. But economic data from 2025 tells a different story. Mexico became the United States' main trading partner, surpassing China. Bilateral trade reached $800 billion annually. 40% of U.S. exports go to Mexico and Canada combined. And here's the crucial fact. Millions of American jobs depend directly on that trade. When Mexico imposes a visa requirement, it's not playing with fire, it's showing it has matches of its own. And the market response in the first hours confirms what economists have known for years. The economic interdependence between the two countries is so deep that any disruption sends shockwaves in both directions. Now I want to explain the immediate consequences we are already seeing. In the first 3 days after the announcement, U.S. flight bookings to Mexico fell 42%. Hotel searches in Mexican destinations collapsed. U.S. travel agencies report mass cancellations for spring break 2026, creating a domino effect that affects American workers. Think of a travel agent in Phoenix, Arizona. Her business depends heavily on selling vacation packages to Cancun, Los Cabos, Puerto Vallarta. Suddenly, her clients cannot travel without weeks of bureaucratic procedures. Her commissions vanish. Think of the pilots and flight attendants on U.S.-Mexico routes. Think of the staff at airports that handle these flights are feeling the impact. Mexico's decision affects thousands of American workers who never imagined that visa policy could threaten their jobs. But there's something deeper here. The tourist visa is only the surface. The real impact is on another sector that few people talk about: reverse medical tourism. Every year, about 1 million Americans travel to Mexico for medical care, dental surgeries, cosmetic procedures, cancer treatments, medications. They do this because the U.S. healthcare system is so expensive that it's cheaper to fly to Mexico, stay a week, get treatment, and return than to pay U.S. prices. A dental implant that costs $4,000 in Texas costs $800 in Tijuana. A knee surgery that costs $50,000 in California costs $8,000 in Guadalajara. Now, these Americans, many retired with fixed incomes, face weeks of paperwork just to access medical care they can afford. The visa requirement doesn't just affect leisure tourists. It affects people who rely on Mexico to take care of their health because their own country has left them behind. This highlights something important about the capitalist system I've studied my whole life. The U.S. presents itself as the world's most powerful economy, yet millions of its citizens cross the border to receive basic care. The U.S. healthcare system generates massive profits for corporations while millions suffer. And now, when Mexico responds to Trump's aggressive measures with reciprocity, the people who suffer the most are the most vulnerable Americans. This is the fundamental contradiction of capitalism I've always pointed out. Decisions are made to benefit elites while ordinary workers bear the consequences. Trump threatens tariffs to appear strong to his base. Mexico responds with visas to protect its national dignity. And in the middle are Arizona retirees who need affordable dentists and airline workers who need their jobs. Now, let me tell you what's happening in Washington's halls of power. My sources say the Department of Commerce held emergency meetings with executives from the main affected companies, American Airlines, Delta, Marriott, Expedia. These corporations are pressuring the Trump administration to negotiate with Mexico. But here's the problem. Trump cannot negotiate without looking weak to his supporters. During his campaign, he promised Mexico would pay for immigration issues. He promised devastating tariffs. He promised mass deportations. Now Mexico responded, and it hurts. If Trump negotiates, his supporters see it as a loss. If he doesn't, the corporations that backed his campaign lose billions. This is the dilemma the Trump administration faces, and there's no easy solution. The modern U.S. economy was built on open borders for capital, but closed borders for people. Corporations can move money, factories, and products freely, but workers, especially Mexicans, face walls, visas, and deportations. This unequal system benefited elites for decades, but Mexico just showed it can use the same migration tools against the U.S. A clear example is the San Diego-Tijuana border, one of the busiest crossings in the world. Every day, tens of thousands of people cross in both directions. Many work in one country and live in another. Many are business people with ventures on both sides. Many families are divided by the border drawn in 1848. When Mexico imposes a visa requirement, the whole ecosystem is affected. It hits San Diego business owners with suppliers in Tijuana, retirees who cross monthly for medicine, tourists visiting restaurants and shops. The border is not just a line on a map. It's an integrated economic system that generates wealth for both countries. And Mexico has just shown it can disrupt it. Historically, Mexico and the U.S. have had economic conflicts, but this is the first time in the modern era that Mexico has the tools to respond effectively. In 1938, President Lázaro Cárdenas nationalized Mexico's oil industry. U.S. and British companies were expelled. The U.S. responded with a harsh economic boycott. Mexico resisted and kept its oil, but the cost was huge. Decades of tension, limited development, constant pressure. In 1982, Mexico faced a devastating debt crisis. The U.S.-dominated IMF imposed strict conditions, privatizations, budget cuts, and opening the economy to foreign capital. Mexico accepted because it had no alternative, no reserves, no alliances, no economic diversity. But 2026 is different. Mexico's international reserves exceed $200 billion. Its economy is one of the largest in the world. Mexico has trade agreements with the European Union, Asian countries, Latin America, and, most importantly, is an observer member of the BRICS alliance, the group of emerging economies reshaping the global economic order. When Mexico imposes visas on Americans, it is not taking a desperate risk. It is acting from a position of strength unseen in generations, and Washington did not expect this. According to my research on the negotiations before the announcement, between November and December 2025, there were secret talks between Mexican and U.S. officials. Mexico warned it would respond to any aggressive measures with exact reciprocity. The Trump administration ignored the warning, thinking it was a bluff that Mexico would not dare. A State Department official told me something revealing. In Washington, there is a mindset that Mexico will always give in because it needs the U.S. too much to risk a real conflict. This mindset comes from decades of asymmetry and the imperial arrogance of U.S. foreign policy. This week, that mindset collided with reality. The Mexico-U.S. conflict does not happen in a vacuum. It happens in a global context where U.S. power is being challenged like never before. China is watching closely. Beijing has strengthened ties with Mexico for years. Infrastructure investments, trade deals, technology cooperation. If the conflict with the U.S. escalates, Mexico has alternatives. Deepen relations with China, diversify trade, reduce dependence on the U.S. The European Union is also watching. Brussels has its own trade conflicts with the Trump administration. A strong Mexico willing to confront the U.S. is a potential ally. Talks are already happening to expand the Mexico-EU trade agreement, increase European investments in Mexican manufacturing, and cooperate on renewable energy. The BRICS countries are watching closely. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and newer members like Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, and the UAE. This alliance represents over 40% of the world's population and more than 30% of global GDP. Mexico, as an observer, can deepen its integration, participate in the BRICS Development Bank, and trade using currencies other than the dollar. This is a tectonic shift in the global economy. International relations have changed. The United States can no longer assume that countries in its sphere of influence will accept any deal. Mexico just proved that, and other countries are watching closely to learn. Now, let me explain how we got to this point, because the current conflict didn't appear out of nowhere. It is the result of years of accumulated tensions that the Trump administration chose to ignore. During his first term from 2017 to 2021, Mexico faced constant threats: the wall, tariffs, deportations, insults. The government of Andrés Manuel López Obrador chose a strategy of patience, avoided direct confrontations, cooperated on migration issues, and kept communication channels open. But internally, Mexico started preparing. International reserves grew, trade diversification progressed, international alliances multiplied, and most importantly, a response strategy was developed, which the Sheinbaum government inherited and is now implementing. What we see today is the result of years of quiet preparation. Mexico does not act randomly. Mexico executes a plan designed precisely for this moment, and this plan involves much more than visas. Let me explain other actions Mexico could take in the coming weeks if the United States escalates the conflict. First action, restrictions on U.S. investment in key sectors. Mexico could limit the participation of U.S. companies in energy, telecommunications, and mining. This would affect giants like ExxonMobil, AT&T, and Newmont Mining. Second action, reviewing security cooperation agreements. Mexico collaborates with the U.S. on intelligence, drug enforcement, and border control. That cooperation is voluntary, not mandatory, and it can be reduced or suspended. Third action, accelerating agreements with China and the European Union. Mexico can offer extra incentives for non-U.S. investments and facilitate the entry of European or Asian products that compete with U.S. goods. Fourth action, strategic use of lithium and other critical minerals. Mexico has large lithium reserves, essential for electric vehicle batteries. It could prioritize exports to friendly countries and restrict U.S. access. Each of these measures comes at a cost for Mexico, but also creates huge problems for the United States. The question the Trump administration must answer is, how much are they willing to pay for their aggressive rhetoric? Now, I want to talk about the human side of this conflict, because behind the numbers and strategies, there are real people being affected. Think of Maria, a Mexican woman who has lived in Los Angeles for 30 years. She has U.S. citizenship, and her 80-year-old mother lives in Guadalajara. Every 2 months, Maria would visit her. Now, even though technically she doesn't need a visa, the tension between the two countries creates uncertainty. Airlines cancel flights, prices rise, and border stress increases. Maria fears that each trip will be harder than the last. Think of John, a retiree from Phoenix who planned to retire in Puerto Vallarta. He sold his house, bought property in Mexico, and started moving, but now faces weeks of visa paperwork. The uncertainty about the future of bilateral relations makes him hesitate. If Mexico imposes more restrictions and the U.S. responds with measures affecting Americans in Mexico, millions of binational families would suffer. Every restriction, every escalation, every aggressive statement affects their ability to stay together. Capitalism and nationalism do not respect family bonds. This is the tragedy I have always pointed out. Elites make decisions based on power and profit, while ordinary workers and families pay the price. Trump gains political points by attacking Mexico. Sheinbaum gains political points by responding firmly. And in the middle, millions suffer from a conflict they did not choose. Now, I want to explain what could happen in the coming weeks and months. Based on my analysis and conversations with sources in both governments, there are 3 possible scenarios. Scenario 1, quick negotiation. Pressure from U.S. corporations forces Trump to negotiate. Mexico agrees to adjust the visa requirement in exchange for U.S. concessions on tariffs, deportations, or investment. Both governments declare victory and tensions drop temporarily. This scenario is possible, but it requires Trump to appear flexible, which is difficult for his personality. Scenario 2, gradual escalation. Neither side gives in. Mexico keeps the visa requirement. The U.S. imposes tariffs or additional restrictions. Mexico responds with more measures from its mirror protocol. The conflict intensifies for weeks or months, causing economic damage to both countries. Eventually, the cost forces negotiation, but from a more confrontational position. Scenario 3, prolonged breakdown. The conflict escalates to a point where bilateral relations suffer structural damage. Mexico accelerates diversification toward China and Europe, while the U.S. seeks to move supply chains out of Mexico. This scenario would cause massive economic damage and take years to reverse. My analysis suggests that scenario 2 is the most likely in the short term. Trump cannot give in quickly without appearing weak. Shanebound cannot back down without losing credibility. Both sides have incentives to maintain confrontation for at least a few weeks. The question is whether they can prevent escalation to scenario 3. Now, from my perspective as a Marxist economist, this conflict shows how the global economic system works. Capitalism is based on exploitation. Rich countries exploit poor ones. Corporations exploit workers. Elites exploit the masses. This exploitation is maintained through military, economic, and political power. The United States has been the center of this system for a century, but that power is weakening. The Mexico-U.S. conflict is a symptom of that weakening. Mexico can confront the U.S. because American power is no longer absolute, because alternatives exist, because decades of globalization created interdependencies that limit coercive power. This does not mean capitalism is ending, but that it is transforming. U.S. capitalism faces competition from Chinese capitalism, European capitalism, and new state-led models emerging in the global South. In this competition, countries like Mexico have more room to maneuver than before. But I want to be clear. Confrontation between governments does not automatically benefit workers. Trump does not represent the interests of U.S. workers. Shanebound does not automatically represent the interests of Mexican workers. Both operate within a system that prioritizes profit over people. The real solution is not that Mexico wins and the U.S. loses, or vice versa. The real solution is for workers in both countries to recognize their shared interests, organize together against the elites who exploit them, and build international solidarity rather than competitive nationalism. I know this sounds utopian. In the short term, we must analyze reality as it is, but as an economist, professor, and citizen, I feel it is my responsibility to point to where we should go while understanding where we are now. Finally, something important I discovered in my research. In the files I reviewed, there are references to an internal Mexican government study calculating what they call the historical debt of the United States to Mexico. This calculation includes the value of the territory lost in 1848, the 2.4 million square kilometers that today are California, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and much of Colorado. It also includes the resources extracted from that territory during